Imagine standing on a frosty Scandinavian plain, the biting wind cutting through your clothes like icy needles, the ground so frozen it could shatter a rock. Now picture yourself as a Viking warrior about to face this brutal chill not just outside, but in every breath you take, every moment you live. It's night time, the temperature plunging to -20 degrees F, and you're miles from home, deep in enemy territory, with only what you can carry on your back. No modern heaters, no down jackets, no instant hot water bottles. So, how did these legendary warriors not just survive but thrive in such merciless conditions? What secrets did they hold tight enough to beat the cold when even the mightiest blizzards raged against them? Here's the kicker. They didn't just make a handful of weapons and call it a day. Vikings once made 100 weapons from a single giant rock. Yes, one rock. This wasn't just impressively frugal. It was ancient mass production on a scale we rarely associate with those fierce Norsemen. Turns out, those weapons weren't just tools of war. They were keys to survival in one of the harshest climates on Earth. This might be the strangest Viking survival trick you've ever heard. So stick with me because everything you think you know about these warriors is about to be flipped on its head. Let's start with that rock. Imagine a massive chunk of iron ore, sitting unassumingly in the rough Scandinavian landscape. To the untrained eye, it's just another boulder. To Viking smiths, it was like a factory in solid form, holding the promise of hundreds of swords, spears, and axes. But how exactly did they pull this off? To understand this, we need to break down their technique. The Vikings weren't simply smelting iron ore and randomly hammering away. They mastered what we might call an early form of metallurgy mass production. Picture this. They identified an enormous piece of high-quality magnetite iron ore, rich in iron content, sometimes upwards of 60 to 70% pure. That's a huge advantage, because the higher the purity, the less waste, and the less fuel you burn heating it. Vikings would chop the ore into workable chunks using stone and bone tools, then painstakingly transport it back to their forges. Here is where it gets fascinating. Instead of smelting each piece separately, they baked large batches in bloomery furnaces, primitive yet efficient devices that could reach temperatures of about 1,100 degrees C, 2012 degrees F. This heat was enough to transform the ore into bloom iron, a spongy mass of metal and slag. The brilliance was in how they preserved the bloom's quality. By repeatedly reheating and hammering while the metal was still hot, they forced out impurities and compacted it. Think of it like kneading dough, but with molten rock. Now, here's a modern comparison for you. Imagine that bloomery furnace as the medieval version of an industrial 1,000-watt heater, a surprisingly efficient and steady source of intense heat that Vikings used not just to melt metal, but to essentially mass produce weapon-grade iron in much larger quantities than you'd expect for that era. Once they had enough iron bloom, they moved onto the crafting stage, where one massive bloom could be divided and hammered into multiple blades or spearheads. It was like getting dozens of crisp knives from a single block of steel. These weapons, forged at temperatures exceeding 900 degrees C, 1652 degrees F, retained remarkable strength and toughness, enough to withstand the brutal impacts of battle and the test of cold. But what does mass production have to do with survival? Here's where the up-close story of these weapons ties into everyday Viking life. The more weapons they made efficiently, the better their ability to protect themselves, secure food through hunting, and expand their territory for farming and resources. This rapid production was like Vikings having a 24/7 sword and spear factory to keep their society alive. And it didn't stop at weapons. Imagine if you had only one rock but could feed it into a furnace and get 100 working weapons back in return. That kind of resourcefulness means the Vikings didn't waste precious time or fuel, crucial in freezing weather when every second outside counted. Their forges burned mostly charcoal made from local wood, which, when smoldering at the right temperature, produced a clean, intense heat ideal for such metal transformations. It was almost like the Viking version of a sustainable factory, keeping the fires burning just right. Not too much to waste fuel, not too little to reduce quality. Now you might think, okay, making swords is cool, but how does this relate to surviving brutal cold and endless winters? Here's the twist. The steel and iron they used for weapons were also repurposed in various tools for daily life. Knives, fishing hooks, farming implements that allowed Vikings to thrive in freezing climates. Weapons were multi-purpose, and mass production meant consistency. Every spearhead wasn't just battle-ready. It was a reliable tool for piercing frozen fish or chopping tough, ice-bound wood. But beyond tools, quality weapons also meant less risk in defending their homes and outposts, reducing stress and injury that could cripple a family's survival chances during the harshest months. Think of it like having a wardrobe full of reliable winter gear instead of a single flimsy coat. These consistent weapons were a part of their survival armor. And that's just the beginning, because the physical toughness of the metal was matched by a mental toughness forged in these swift, relentless production cycles. The demand for weaponry pushed Vikings to innovate rapidly in metallurgy, adapting blooms, smelting techniques, and hammering methods to get the most out of every single ore deposit they found. To put this in perspective, before industrial steel production in the 18th century, most societies struggled to produce large quantities of reliable iron goods, often depending on imported materials. Vikings, centuries earlier, managed small-scale mass production from a single resource, showcasing an ancient yet remarkably savvy industrial process. But let's step back and picture what this looked like on a daily level. Imagine a Viking village, smoke curling from numerous small furnaces, young smiths hammering iron scraps into blades while seasoned warriors continuously test their edges. Each weapon passing from forge to fire to hammer was a piece of a life-saving puzzle, made possible by the efficiency born from that one massive rock. And yes, the rock was literally the cornerstone of both their weaponry and, by extension, their survival. It's like having a massive, never-ending Costco for swords. But instead of shopping carts, you held hammers, anvils, and burning coals. But even with this impressive weapon mass production system, new challenges loomed. Temperatures were relentless, and not all parts of their gear could be replaced so readily. Steel kept them sharp, but it couldn't keep them warm. So, what did the Vikings do next? How did they protect their bodies against the unforgiving cold when even moving a few feet outside felt like walking through ice water? Stay with me, because now we're diving into the Viking toolkit for cold survival. Not just weapons, but their layered clothing systems that acted like nature's version of Gore-Tex combined with ancient hot water bottles. But first, a little confession. The tale of that one rock and its 100 weapons might sound like an epic myth, almost too good to be true. Scientists have dug deep into Viking sites, used chemical analysis on their metal artifacts, and unearthed massive bloomery remains that prove this wasn't just legend but real, documented ancient industrial success. It's a perfect reminder that sometimes the simplest natural resource can become the foundation of an entire culture's power. And with that rock fueling their fights, farming, and fishing tools, Vikings could focus on surviving the cold nights. And trust me, those nights were brutal. Imagine freezing fog turning your breath into frost, fingers going numb in minutes, and a snowstorm that lasts for days. Next up, we'll explore how Vikings fought frostbite with clever insulation techniques. From layering animal hides soaked in oils to using moss in shoes that acted like medieval bubble wrap, trapping warmth and moisture while keeping the deadly cold at bay. So if you think surviving Vikings were just about brute strength and fearless raids, think again. Their story is as much about brains and innovation as it is about brawn. From one single rock, 100 weapons emerged, fueling a lifestyle of adaptability and resilience that still resonates today. Keep watching, because the tricks Vikings used to survive Arctic temperatures will change how you think about cold weather survival forever. Now picture this. You're standing at the edge of a snowy forest where the wind howls between bare branches, and the chill wraps around you like a second skin. Your fingers, numb and stiff, struggle to grasp tools, but Vikings had a trick for that too, because mass-produced weapons alone didn't warm their bodies. So how did they fight the cold biting at their very flesh when trading blades wasn't enough? Here's the twist. Vikings mastered layering their clothing the way modern gear engineers design thermal wear today. Think of their outfits like nature's version of Gore-Tex, long before Gore and Tex even existed. They started with tight-fitting linen undershirts, which, despite sounding thin, were surprisingly effective at wicking moisture away. Why does that matter? Because when you sweat in freezing conditions, wet fabric becomes a deadly conductor of cold. The Vikings knew this instinctively. Over the linen, they'd layer wool, a fabric that's a natural insulator, trapping air, and even when wet, still providing warmth. The Vikings didn't just toss on any wool garment, though. They carefully treated their wool with animal fats and oils, making the outer layers water-resistant, crucial when snow and sleet poured relentlessly. Imagine a medium-weight jacket soaked in a thin layer of grease, repelling the dampness and keeping the chill from your skin, like an ancient version of rainproof spray. And that wasn't all. Their trousers and tunics were deliberately loose in some areas, but tighter in others, creating trapped pockets of air that functioned as miniature insulation chambers. Picture walking around wearing dozens of tiny, heat-trapping bubbles hugging your ribs, your thighs, and your back. Every inch was engineered to hold warmth, just like the modern bubble wrap packaging protects fragile goods, except this wrap was alive, moving with them in the freezing tundra. But all that warmth would vanish if their extremities froze. Fingers, toes, and noses are the first casualties of frostbite. So how did they protect what little skin was exposed? Their solution might sound bizarre, but it worked like a charm. They stuffed their boots and mittens with moss, a super light, fluffy natural sponge that held air and moisture. This moss insulation worked like a medieval bubble wrap for their feet and hands, creating layers of trapped air that resisted cold. Scientists today call this thermal loft insulation, and we still use it in high-end winter gear. The Vikings were basically slipping on boots lined with nature's own synthetic insulation. Imagine wading through knee-deep snow, your feet warm and dry, while your foes trembled, numb and immobile. Now, imagine nighttime in a Viking village. Outside, temperatures plummet to minus 30 degrees F, the kind of cold that saps breath and steals warmth fast. Vikings didn't just huddle by fire. They constructed their homes with a kind of ancient engineering savvy. Their longhouses had walls up to 2 feet thick, built from layered turf and alder wood. Packed so tightly, they kept the howling wind out and the precious heat in. It was like living inside a giant thermos, preserving the warmth produced by cooking fires in human bodies. Inside, they used animal hides and fur draped over benches and floors, creating layered insulation, almost like putting a thick wool blanket on every surface. When they laid on their beds, which were raised from the cold earthen floor, those layers prevented heat loss through conduction. Sleeping above the cold helped, but it was the combination of air pockets, dense hides, and warmth from bodies squeezed close together that made surviving Arctic winters possible. And did you know Vikings often slept beside their iron tools? Those blazing hot weapons just forged weren't simply for fighting. When heated up, they doubled as ancient hot water bottles to warm up hands and feet before bedtime. Imagine pressing a glowing spearhead against frozen skin, the radiant heat seeping in, fighting frostbite without a single electric blanket or heated mattress. This simple but effective use of weaponry for warmth gives new meaning to multi-purpose gear. But even with all these clothing layers and home designs, the cold was merciless, and the Vikings turned inward to another surprising tactic: diet. They understood that survival wasn't just about external heat but internal fuel, keeping the body's core temperature up in a near-constant metabolic furnace. Picture the Vikings sitting around a smoky fire, eating meals rich in protein and incredibly high-fat content. Up to 75% of their diets came from fatty fish, wild game, and dairy products. Fat is a dense energy source, releasing 9 calories per gram, well over double that of carbs or protein, making it the perfect fuel to keep muscles and internal systems humming at full throttle, even when fingers were turning blue outside. This energy-heavy diet created a body heat factory, generating warmth from within that layer of sophisticated clothing alone couldn't provide. Scientists today studying cold-adapted populations, like the Inuit, have confirmed similar metabolic strategies, showing that nature and necessity shape what humans eat just as much as what they wear. And it didn't stop there. Vikings developed a sophisticated understanding of preserving food to last through the dark, cold winters. They smoked, salted, and fermented fish and meat, processes that locked in nutrients and made high-fat, protein-rich foods available all year round. Thanks to that mass weapon production from the Iron Rock, tools for hunting and fishing were abundant and reliable, enabling efficient food gathering and preservation. A spearhead from that one rock wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to securing meals and warmth through the dead of winter. Each iron fishing hook or net weight was part of an ancient survival inventory, a lifeline made from that volcanic forge deep beneath their nails. And even as overwhelming cold seemed to drain their spirits like they were melting ice sculptures, Vikings kept their communities connected by rituals, storytelling, and feasts. These social ties served a vital biological purpose. Human warmth shared blatantly through gatherings reinforced both physical and mental resilience against the endless cold. To imagine it, a night where firelight flickers in a longhouse, where 100 weapons forged from one rock line the walls, not just symbols of war but beacons of survival, while voices hummed tales of storms survived and battles won. It was not just tools in their hands. It was hope, strength, and the fierce will to endure, keeping the stories of their ancestors alive under the frozen skies. So what can this ancient Viking blueprint teach us in today's harsh climates or even unexpected survival scenarios? First, innovation is about maximizing every resource. From a single massive chunk of iron ore, Vikings crafted 100 blades and spearheads, fueling hunting, farming, and defense, a true production marvel with limited means. Their metallurgy process combined with smart fuel use set a precedent for sustainable industry, centuries ahead of their time. Second, survival is holistic. It's not just weapons or warmth alone, but a synchronized system of clothing, shelter, diet, and community. Vikings layered protection, from thermal linen undershirts to moss-filled boots, thick turf homes, and energy-packed meals that work together like ancient living technology. Third, human adaptability is astonishing, forged as much by intellect as by necessity. When faced with the brutal cold, Vikings chose ingenuity over surrender, turning raw materials into tools and tools into life-saving armor. And here's the final thought. That one rock, cold and heavy as the land itself, was a symbol of resilience. It was a reminder that even in the harshest, most unforgiving places, humans can carve out survival, not by force alone, but by innovation, culture, and relentless spirit. Every weapon, every layer of clothing, every heated iron tool reflected a choice. A choice to protect families, to preserve a culture, and to leave a legacy that still echoes in our collective imagination today. So next time you shiver through a cold night, remember the Vikings, not as mere barbarians clashing swords, but as pioneers of mass production, masters of layering, and champions of survival. They held the frozen world at bay with nothing but iron, animal skins, fire, and unbreakable will. Because the story of one rock, turned into 100 weapons, isn't just about metallurgy. It's about the power of human ingenuity to transform nature's fiercest challenges into triumph. And that is the ultimate legacy of the Vikings. A lesson that when faced with cold, darkness, and despair, survival depends on courage, creativity, and the fierce determination to not just endure, but to thrive.